Thank you. Hi, so I'm Amy Devine and I am presenting today with Carla Pastorino-Campos. And together we co-lead a research agenda at Cambridge, which is focused on JEDI, so justice, equity, diversity and inclusion. So global English language tests are often developed in contexts where inclusive education is embedded in policy and practice. In countries such as the UK, the USA and Canada, test design is typically guided by international EDI frameworks and professional standards, such as the ILTA guidelines that Evelina outlined at the beginning. However, these global tests are used across highly diverse global contexts where perspectives on inclusion can vary widely. So this presentation explores the tension between striving for inclusivity in test design and operating in markets where inclusion may be interpreted differently or even face legislative resistance. We'll talk through a few projects we've been working on that aim to bring a structured and systematic approach to how we explore and embed JEDI into our product design. And at the same time, we'll cover some of the challenges we've encountered and continue to encounter, especially when advocating for ethical practices that may, for example, increase production costs or carry a risk of derecognition in certain markets. So as researchers in language assessment, we have a responsibility to promote evidence-based, inclusive, and representative approaches to product development. But at the same time, that responsibility exists alongside very real practical and commercial pressures. There is often a tension between what our ethical frameworks tell us we should do and the need to develop learning and assessment materials that are widely accessible and acceptable across different contexts. Navigating this balance is central to our work. We carry out empirical research to generate evidence that supports informed and responsible decision-making. Although views on fairness and justice can differ, within the language testing field, fairness is generally understood to involve the absence of bias, as well as equal opportunity and equitable treatment for all test takers. And from a justice perspective, a just system seeks to minimize harm and maximize positive human outcomes, while also recognizing and addressing systematic inequalities and their impact on marginalized groups. So to support our work, we have developed a JEDI research agenda that provides the structured approach to embedding fairness and justice in our products and services. And this agenda focuses on three key areas. First, inclusion. We conduct research to ensure our products are accessible to as many learners and test takers as possible. And this includes work on accessibility, access arrangements, and inclusive design. Second, representation. We aim to reflect the diversity of learners and test takers, as well as the wider society in which language is used. And a key focus here is inclusive and diverse content creation. And then finally, fairness and validity. We ensure that our assessments do not advantage or disadvantage particular groups. And this includes research on bias and construct irrelevant variance. But today we are focusing primarily on our work within the representation strand. And the first program of research that we're going to cover relates to the use of global English's accents in listening assessment. And this work was motivated by the observation that real-life environments are often multicultural and multilingual, but tests rarely portray this diversity. We asked whether it might be possible to include non-standard accents in English language tests without compromising their fairness. And this research program has included a systematic review of existing research, as well as gathering test taker and teacher perceptions. And then finally, we've also conducted an empirical trial of different English accent varieties, including AI voices with different English accents. And our preliminary findings suggest that incorporating diverse English varieties can enhance authenticity and fairness in assessments. The second area we'd like to describe is our work on representing non-heteronormative families. which was motivated by the observation that tests rarely reflect the diversity of relationships and families that exist in real-life environments. And we asked whether it might be possible to include non-heteronormative families in English language tests without compromising their fairness. And we conducted an exploratory trial to answer the research question, does including non-heteronormative relationships in assessment content affect learner performance and perceptions? Our trial involved 77 Spanish L1 participants from Spain or Mexico, and we found that performance was comparable on reading tasks with and without same-sex family representation, and that most participants supported the inclusion of non-heteronormative content in English language tests. I'll now hand over to Carla, who will compare the two projects in terms of the research need and the challenges that we faced.
Thank you, Amy. So you may have noticed when Amy was describing the representation projects in our research agenda that the need they address is almost identical, which is to represent in the test the diversity of the real world. And as test providers, it is part of our remit to understand how language is being used in real life and to bring that understanding to our test materials to the best of our abilities. It is a difficult task, as Evelina was mentioning. There are practicalities and other concerns to be had. And also because the spaces where English is used are many and very diverse. We try nonetheless, understanding that there's always a tension between authenticity and the limits of what language tests may represent. You may also have noticed, and here in this slide you can see it, that the overarching concern or challenge about authentic representation is also very similar for these two projects that we're talking to you about today. As much as we would like to authentically represent a variety of English uses and societies, we do not want to disadvantage test takers. For this reason, we need to reflect on the impact that any changes in content could have on test validity and fairness. And particularly, we're concerned about how any changes may impact our test takers. Next slide, please. And even though I mentioned some of the similarities of the challenges that we face, this similarity mostly apply to what we call the fairness challenge. In fact, while the fairness challenge remains similar across these two projects, which is concerned with whether any changes to the existing test will disadvantage test takers, the commercial focus challenges are very different. For global Englishes, a typical question that we may hear is related to the operational cost of changing the accents in listening materials. So a question might be, it is expensive to produce listening materials. Should we really change what we have? Is it necessary? For non-heteronormative family representation, on the other hand, the challenge may focus on how the test will be perceived in different contexts, particularly when it comes to its recognition. So a question is, some markets do not accept same-sex contacts. Will our test be de-recognized? And in this context, that means they will not be accepted, for example, for university admissions or for migration purposes. Next slide, please. So in both cases, we see that the concern is about commercial impact, which is understandable for a test provider. But for global Englishes, the challenge to overcome is one of increasing costs. This is something that is somewhat under control of the test provider and that can be mitigated somehow. So the challenge, though it is present and we need to address it, is medium. In the case of non-heteronormative family representation, the challenge is about market attitudes. Social attitudes towards different groups is not something that a single test providers can change as much as we would like to. As justice theory tells us, social justice in the realm of language testing or testing in general is about systemic concerns, ones that may not be easily addressed from a single source. And we also must not forget that large companies, like the ones that produce tests, attract diversity of thought. So the detractors for some of these proposed changes or of more socially conscious ideas, maybe even speaking from within the organizations. But luckily, so are we. And following some words from Jennifer Randalls in one of her plenaries in ILTA, we have infiltrated the company, so we're working from within. Next slide, please. So the hopeful message I have for you today is that, as Amy explained, we are doing this research. This research is being done, and we are looking for ways to implement them when possible. So we are attempting to tackle the challenge that is presented. For global Englishes, as we mentioned before, we have the challenge of increasing cost and operational concerns. So we're trying to find an operational solution. And as Amy mentioned, we are investigating options to use AI voices, for example, to produce a diversity of English or global Englishes accents. From the not heteronormative family perspective, we talked about the challenge being one of market attitudes and sociocultural concerns. So what we're trying to do there is providing thought leadership for internal and external audiences, and in a way trying to influence the spaces to see whether there is a space for non-heteronormative family content in tests. And this is a systemic change, so naturally it's a little bit more difficult, but we're hopeful. Next slide, please. So finally, we want to tell you that with our research, we hope to provide the evidence that may support a path towards a more positively impactful, fair, valid, and authentically representative test. And we do find hurdles in the way, but that's why we're trying to find solutions that are aligned with the kinds of concerns that some of our stakeholders may have. But we acknowledge that this is a long journey, and we're trying to go along the way with as much evidence as we can. So thank you very much. This is what we have for you today, and we welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. Lots of applause again from for Carla and Amy. Always really good to see that. So can I just kick off, Carla? You said that you've infiltrated the company, and one of your strategies for a solution is thought leadership, raising awareness. Can you say a little bit more about that? You know, how are you doing this? What have been some of your wins? What are some of the challenges with that awareness raising work that you're doing?
Yes, thank you. So one example is what we're doing today here. We are trying to spread the word about the research that we're doing. Some of the key things that we may encounter are concerns surrounding the effect on test takers, as we mentioned before. So what we're trying to do is to provide an evidence base to see whether the inclusion of a variety of different content has an effect on, for example, scores or the process to conduct a test. So essentially, that's our way of addressing those problems, this sort of thought leadership influencing side of our work. But it's a long journey, so only just starting, and we thank you all for being here and listening to us, because that furthers our work.
Thank you so much. And moving on to a specific question about the non-heteronormative content study, this will be a chance for you to say a little bit more. Jonathan is saying you had a promising result with a Spanish population where non-heteronormative representation is perhaps more accepted. But what about cultures which may be less accepting of such inclusion? What are your thoughts on how to manage those contexts?
Amy, do you want to take this one?
Okay, so firstly, just to explain a little bit more about the sample that was selected for that particular study, we actually contrasted Spain and Mexico because we used a global values survey. And these two countries had slightly differing views on the acceptability of homosexuality. And so we decided to contrast those. They were not extreme, but they were slightly differing, with Mexico being slightly less accepting of homosexuality. So we wanted to contrast that for that study. And we didn't find much in the way of differences, or actually it went counter to what we were expecting. But yeah, that's research that's still to be published, actually. But we are looking at doing further research in different contexts, of course. But also we would probably not be considering publishing these types of materials in countries in which it was not accepted. Carla, would you like to say more there?
Yeah, so one of our key concerns is that we don't want to introduce let our test takers or teachers feel unsafe with our materials. So in those spaces where, for example, it is illegal to have same-sex content, or it is very heavily restricted, that wouldn't be a possibility for us, either for the research or for the actual implementation. So we're not choosing those contexts, but we did make an attempt to find contexts where we wouldn't expect to have a blanket approval or a blanket disapproval of the materials. It didn't quite go the way we hoped, but it that's research, like Amy said.
Thank you so much. So actually, that answers Catherine Hughes' question as well. She said, well, what about countries in which non-heterosexual relationships are actually illegal? So you've just addressed that. Again, it's about the importance of context. It's not a blanket approach. And Carla and Amy, from what you've said, you really tried to select context where we're not crossing any big lines in terms of the attitude to this. Okay. And then a question from Nicola, who says, this is about the other study, the Global English study. You'll be switching between one and the other. So is it really possible or feasible to represent the full variety of accents from around the world? Any thoughts on that?
Of course not. It is not possible to represent the full variety of accents. However, we did try to find different types of accents. So there is a model to understand varieties of English. I always pronounce the name incorrectly. So Amy, I will invite you.
It's Kashru's model. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we're talking about sort of the more commonly represented accents and varieties being things like British English, or American Standard, British. Then we have the second circle, which I always forget.
Inner circle. There's inner circle, outer circle, expanding circle.
Yeah. So the outer circle, we have sort of the places where English was expanded to through colonialism, and the final one is through globalization. So we try to pick varieties from each one of these circles for our study, but there will be a lot more discussion if this goes into live tests about which exactly are the varieties that are going to be represented.
And can I ask a more specific question from Andrew, who says, what accents have you actually trialed in your listening tests? So if you can tell us a bit more about your methodology.
So we have a French-Canadian accent, and we have a Hindi-Indian accent, voice actors, and also AI voices with the same accents.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up this with just a broad question from Emily, who taps into both of the research projects you talked about. She asks, do you think it might work for the big names in test creators, and of course Cambridge is one of those, to all sign up to a code of conduct that, for example, they commit to agreeing to represent people with JEDI principles in mind? So what are your thoughts on having this JEDI approach that the big test providers sign up to?
I think it's a really good question. There are a code of conduct out there that us as test providers adhere to. Whether they have enforceability, that's a different question altogether. But certainly we do adhere to code of conduct, as Evelina mentioned at the beginning, that do imply at least that representation is part of what we understand to be fairness and validity. So I think in general terms, the intentions are there. I don't know if you.
No, I don't have anything to add to that. Yeah. I agree with what you said. Yeah.
Very much the intentions are there. It's true. We do have such policy and principles, but sociocultural concerns, which is what you started with in the beginning of your talk, are very powerful, and so they cannot be disregarded as easy to overcome. Okay, I will wrap up with Carla and Amy's presentation here. Thank you both very much for giving us access to this interesting research that has been happening at Cambridge in your research team.